January 1943. Central Tunisia. The land is hard and colorless beneath a winter sky. Cold wind cuts across the hills, carrying dust instead of snow. Steel tracks grind against stone. Engines idle low, controlled, confident. German panzer columns wait just beyond the ridgeline. Their commanders have seen this story before. In Poland, in France, in the opening months of Russia. Enemy armor shattered, infantry scattered, resistance folded under steel and speed. Across the valley, American units dig in. Many of the men are new to combat. Their tanks, M3 Lees and light Stuarts, sit exposed, tall silhouettes against open ground. Their guns are smaller, their armor thinner, their doctrine untested. Axis intelligence reports are blunt. The Americans, they say, have industry, but no experience. Factories, not fighters. Numbers, not skill. Against German armor, they are expected to break. Panzer crews check optics. Gunners run gloved hands over breeches worn smooth by years of war. They know the range. They know the terrain. They believe the outcome is already decided. When the order comes, the first shells will not be warnings. They will be confirmations of a belief held since 1939, that German armored warfare has no equal, and that the Americans, facing panzers for the first time, have no real answer. But the battlefield is about to become a classroom, and a lesson will be paid for in fire, steel, and blood, the myth of panzer supremacy. By the winter of 1942, German armored warfare carried a reputation forged in shock and speed. 3 years earlier, in September 1939, the world had watched Poland collapse in weeks, not because the Polish army lacked courage, but because it faced a form of warfare it could not counter in time. German panzer divisions moved as integrated machines. Tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support advanced together, coordinated by radio, striking weak points with precision. It was not merely armor. It was systemized violence. France followed in May 1940. The French army possessed more tanks than Germany. Many were heavier, better armored, and better armed, yet they were dispersed, parceled out in support of infantry, while German panzers were concentrated into independent armored divisions. At Sedan, German armor punched through what French planners believed impassable terrain. Within 6 weeks, Paris fell. An entire military doctrine collapsed alongside it. By 1941, the myth had hardened into certainty. Operation Barbarossa unleashed the largest armored invasion in history. Panzer groups surged hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Though the Red Army would ultimately adapt and survive, the opening months reinforced a dangerous assumption inside the Axis command structure. Properly handled German armor could not be stopped by unprepared opponents. At the center of this belief stood the Panzer Force itself. By 1942, the Panzer III and Panzer IV had matured into reliable battlefield weapons. The Panzer III, armed initially with a 37mm gun and later upgraded to a 50mm, was fast, mechanically dependable, and tactically flexible. The Panzer IV, originally intended as a support tank, evolved into Germany's primary battle tank, mounting longer barrel 75mm guns capable of engaging enemy armor at distance. But hardware alone did not create dominance. German tank crews were professionals shaped by continuous combat. Many commanders had fought since Poland. They understood terrain, timing, and coordination. Radios were standard in every tank, allowing real-time maneuver, a decisive advantage over enemies still relying on flags, runners, or prearranged orders. Equally important was command culture. German armored doctrine encouraged initiative. Junior officers were expected to act independently when conditions changed. Speed was not reckless. It was calculated. Engagements were chosen, not accepted by default. If resistance stiffened, panzers bypassed it, isolating defenders and leaving them to be reduced later. Axis intelligence evaluated enemies through this lens. The British had learned painfully in North Africa. At Gazala and Tobruk, German armor under Rommel repeatedly outmaneuvered British formations, exploiting poor coordination and rigid command structures. The Soviets, though improving, were still absorbing catastrophic losses in 1942. Then came the Americans. From Berlin and Rome, U.S. forces appeared inexperienced and theoretical. The American Army had not fought a major ground war in Europe since 1918. Its officers trained in classrooms and exercises, not under fire. Reports emphasize American industrial capacity, but question whether that strength translated into battlefield competence. German assessments noted unfamiliar tank models, tall silhouettes, thin armor, short-barrel guns. They were not impressed. To Axis planners, American armor represented mass without mastery, machines without doctrine, crews without seasoning. And in armored warfare, seasoning mattered. As 1942 turned into 1943, German commanders believed they understood the equation. If American tanks met panzers head-on, the result would mirror earlier campaigns. What they did not yet see was that this war would not reward static judgments, and that the Americans were about to enter their first brutal trial by armor, an army unready for steel-on-steel war. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, it did so with confidence in its industrial strength, but deep uncertainty in its ground combat doctrine. Between the wars, the U.S. Army had not ignored tanks. It had misunderstood them. American military thinking remained shaped by the First World War, where tanks existed primarily to support infantry. They were tools to cross trenches, suppress machine guns, and advance methodically behind artillery. Mobility was secondary. Independent armor maneuver was viewed with suspicion. In official doctrine, tanks were not meant to fight other tanks. That role belonged to a different concept entirely. The U.S. Army developed the idea of the tank destroyer, fast, lightly armored vehicles designed to counter enemy armor through speed and firepower rather than protection. This theory assumed German tanks would attack in mass formations, exposing themselves to ambush by mobile anti-tank forces. It was a clean solution on paper. On real battlefields, it would fracture. As a result, American tank design reflected compromise. The M3 Stuart Light tank was fast and mechanically reliable, but lightly armored and undergunned. Against early war opponents, it performed adequately. Against late-war German armor, it was outmatched. The M3 Lee, rushed into service in 1941, was a stopgap born of urgency. Its 75mm gun was mounted in a sponson on the hull, limiting traverse. A smaller turret housed a secondary gun. The vehicle was tall, awkward, and vulnerable. It was not designed to duel German panzers in open terrain. Yet these were the tanks sent into combat. Training compounded the problem. American armored units were well drilled in maneuver exercises but lacked combat realism. Crews had limited experience coordinating with infantry, artillery, and air support under fire. Many officers were new to their commands, promoted rapidly as the Army expanded from a peacetime force into a global one. North Africa would be their proving ground. Operation Torch, launched in November 1942, landed American forces in Morocco and Algeria. The initial fighting against Vichy French units was brief. The true test lay ahead, against seasoned German formations moving west from Tunisia. By early 1943, U.S. II Corps faced elements of the German 5th Panzer Army. These were not second-line units. They included veterans from the Eastern Front in Africa, commanded by officers who understood exactly how to exploit inexperience. The terrain favored the attacker. Wide valleys, broken hills, and long sightlines allowed armor to maneuver and engage at range. American units, spread thin and lacking cohesive defensive planning, occupied exposed positions. Coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery was inconsistent. Communications were fragile. German commanders saw opportunity. Their intelligence confirmed what they suspected. American tanks advanced without adequate reconnaissance. Defensive positions lacked depth. Anti-tank guns were poorly sighted. Command responses were slow, bound to rigid chains of approval. In February 1943, near a series of mountain passes in central Tunisia, the confrontation became inevitable. For the Axis, this was expected to be confirmation. Another opponent undone by Panzer doctrine. For the Americans, it would be something else entirely. Not a defeat alone, but a reckoning, a moment when theory collapsed under fire, forcing change at the cost of lives. And as German armor began to move, the gap between belief and reality narrowed toward a single decisive collision. Men, methods, and misjudgment. Human angle. American crews under first fire. For many American tank crews in early 1943, the war arrived without warning. They had trained for months, sometimes years, inside steel hulls on open ranges. They knew checklists, formations, and commands. But combat was different. There were no referees, no pauses, no second chances. When German shells struck, the sound was not like training. It was concussive, violent, final, inside American tanks. The first hits shattered confidence as much as armor. Crews discovered that their rounds often failed to penetrate panzer fronts at distance. Return fire came faster, more accurately. Vehicles burned. Escape hatches jammed. Smoke filled cramped interiors. Men who had never seen a tank destroyed watched friends vanish in flashes of flame. Survival became instinctive rather than doctrinal. Some crews froze. Others withdrew without orders. A few fought on, firing until their guns overheated or ammunition ran out. Courage was present. But courage alone could not compensate for structural disadvantage. This was not cowardice. It was shock, enemy angle, German confidence, and calculated contempt. On the opposite side, German panzer crews approached the Americans without uncertainty. Reports described American tanks as tall and easy to spot. Their armor could be penetrated reliably by standard German guns. Their formations lacked cohesion. Their reaction times were slow. German gunners took deliberate shots. Commanders maneuvered with patience. There was no need to rush, no need to gamble. Veteran panzer officers viewed the Americans as technically proficient but tactically naive. Their confidence was not arrogance. It was based on experience. They had seen similar opponents before. They expected the same result. Each burning American tank reinforced that belief. Tactical angle. Why early U.S. methods failed. The battlefield exposed fundamental flaws in American approach. Tanks advanced without infantry support, leaving them vulnerable to anti-tank guns and flanking fire. Defensive positions were linear rather than layered, allowing German armor to penetrate and roll up formations from behind. Artillery was present, but poorly integrated, often reacting rather than shaping engagements. Most critically, American units attempted to fight panzer tactics symmetrically. They met maneuver with maneuver, fire with fire, and lost. German doctrine emphasized concentration and timing. American units, scattered and inexperienced, could not mass combat power quickly enough. By the time responses formed, German armor had already repositioned. This was not a failure of individual soldiers. It was a failure of assumptions, and the cost was becoming impossible to ignore. As smoke drifted across Tunisian valleys, one truth hardened on both sides. The test had only begun, and the next phase would decide whether the Americans could learn fast enough to survive. Steel, command, and adaptation. Technological angle. Guns, armor, and mechanical reality. On paper, American tanks were not inferior in every category. They were reliable, easier to maintain, faster to produce. But armored warfare was not fought on paper. In Tunisia, technological gaps became visible at engagement ranges measured in seconds. The short-barreled 75mm gun of the M3 Lee could fire a powerful high-explosive round, but its armor-piercing performance was limited at distance. German Panzer IVs, now equipped with longer-barreled 75mm guns, could engage American tanks before effective return fire was possible. Armor thickness favored the Germans as well, angled, compact, and designed for survivability. Equally decisive was profile. American tanks stood taller. They were easier to spot, easier to range. In open terrain, visibility was lethality. Mechanical reliability kept tanks moving, but movement alone could not compensate for exposure. Leadership angle, shock, accountability, and change. The battlefield did not only test machines, it tested commanders. American senior leadership in North Africa was fragmented. Command relationships were unclear. Decisions were centralized at a time when speed mattered most. Orders traveled slowly. Opportunities vanished. The defeat at Kasserine Pass forced accountability. General Dwight D. Eisenhower recognized that failure was systemic, not accidental. Commanders were replaced, procedures rewritten, authority pushed downward, coordination emphasized relentlessly. One figure emerged as emblematic of this shift. George S. Patton arrived not as a miracle, but as an enforcer. Discipline tightened. Training intensified. Units were reorganized with clarity of purpose. Patton did not invent new doctrine. He demanded existing doctrine be executed with aggression and precision. The U.S. Army was learning, painfully, but learning. Industrial angle, mass modification, and momentum. Behind the front lines, another force was already at work. American industry did not pause to debate theory. It adapted. Factories modified designs rapidly. Production lines scaled without precedent. Spare parts flowed. Damaged tanks were repaired and returned to service faster than Axis planners believed possible. Most importantly, lessons from combat fed directly back into development. The M4 Sherman, already entering service, was refined, not to outgun every Panzer, but to operate within a combined system. Mobility, reliability, coordination with artillery, and air power. The American answer to German armor was not a single machine. It was a process. And as the U.S. Army absorbed its failures, the Axis assumption that Americans could not adapt under fire began to erode. The next confrontation would no longer be a rehearsal. It would be decisive. Kasserine Pass, February 14, 1943, Central Tunisia. The Kasserine Pass cuts through the Atlas Mountains like a wound. Narrow, steep, unforgiving. For centuries, it had been a route for armies moving east and west across North Africa. Now, it became the focal point of the first true armored collision between the United States Army and the Wehrmacht. German commanders saw the pass as an invitation. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, temporarily commanding Axis forces in Tunisia, recognized the opportunity immediately. Allied forces were overstretched. American units were inexperienced. Defensive positions were shallow and poorly coordinated. A concentrated armored thrust could fracture the front. The attack began before dawn. German panzer divisions advanced through fog and dust, their movement screened by terrain and timing. Artillery softened American positions. Then the tanks moved methodical, controlled, exploiting gaps rather than forcing breakthroughs head-on. American defenses unraveled quickly. Units that had never trained together were suddenly expected to fight together. Communications failed under pressure. Orders contradicted one another. Some positions held briefly, then collapsed when flanked. Others withdrew prematurely. Opening corridors the Germans exploited without hesitation. Panzer IVs and assault guns engaged American armor at range. The results were devastating. American shells bounced or shattered against German frontal armor. Return fire penetrated decisively. Tank after tank burned in the narrow valleys, blocking movement and spreading panic. Infantry units, lacking effective anti-tank support, pulled back under relentless pressure. By February 19th, Axis forces had punched through Kasserine Pass. For the Germans, the battle confirmed long-held beliefs. Their armor had defeated another opponent using familiar methods. The Americans appeared predictable, rigid, and vulnerable to maneuver warfare. Rommel pressed forward, but with caution. Fuel shortages, extended supply lines, and increasing Allied air activity limited his options. The breakthrough was tactically successful but strategically constrained. For the Americans, Kasserine was a shock bordering on disaster. Nearly 7,000 casualties were suffered in days. Equipment losses were severe. Entire units were disorganized or rendered ineffective. Morale suffered. Not because soldiers lacked courage, but because they understood how unprepared they had been. Yet within the chaos, something began to shift. Reports moved rapidly up the chain of command. Failures were documented. Excuses were rejected. The defeat was not explained away. It was confronted. Kasserine was the lowest point of American armor credibility in the war. But it was also the moment when denial ended. As Axis units paused to consolidate, the U.S. Army began rebuilding its approach. Not in months, but in weeks. The question now was whether those changes would come fast enough. Learning under fire. The days after Kasserine Pass were marked by urgency. There was no time for gradual reform. The front was still active. German forces remained dangerous. The U.S. Army had to adapt while fighting, or risk being pushed out of Tunisia entirely. Command changes came first. Senior officers deemed ineffective were relieved. Clear lines of authority were established. Responsibility for failure was no longer diluted across committees. Decisions were expected to be fast, direct, and enforced. Training followed immediately behind the lines. Tank crews drilled in coordination with infantry. Artillery officers rehearsed rapid-fire missions in support of armor. Forward observers were embedded where they could see the battlefield, not just map grids. Communication protocols were simplified. Initiative was encouraged. Most importantly, American forces abandoned the idea of fighting German armor on German terms. They stopped seeking tank versus tank duels as the primary solution. Instead, they integrated systems. When panzers advanced, artillery engaged first, blanketing approach routes with high explosive. Infantry protected flanks and cleared anti-tank positions. Air power, increasingly dominant as weather improved, struck concentrations and supply lines. Tanks became part of a larger mechanism. The M4 Sherman, now arriving in numbers, embodied this philosophy. It was not invulnerable. German long-barrel guns could destroy it, but it was mechanically reliable, fast to repair, and available in overwhelming quantity. A destroyed Sherman could be replaced. A trained crew could be reassigned. German commanders began to notice the difference. By late February and early March 1943, American units were no longer collapsing under pressure. Defensive positions were layered. Withdrawals were controlled. Counterattacks were coordinated. German advances slowed, not because panzers had lost power, but because the battlefield environment had changed. The final phase of the Tunisian campaign sealed the transformation. At battles such as El Getter, American forces held against repeated German armored assaults. Well-sighted anti-tank guns, mass artillery, and coordinated infantry blunted panzer thrusts. German losses mounted. Momentum shifted. Axis commanders revised their assessments. The Americans were no longer amateurs. They were absorbing punishment and returning it efficiently. When Tunisia fell in May 1943, more than 250,000 Axis troops were captured. German and Italian forces in North Africa ceased to exist as a fighting entity. The belief that Americans had no answer to panzer armor had not vanished, but it had cracked. And from Sicily to Normandy, that crack would widen. The next test would come on European soil, where German armor had once ruled uncontested. Attrition, adaptation, and the end of initiative. By the summer of 1944, the armored war in Europe no longer resembled the contests of 1939 or 1940. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, German panzer divisions still possessed formidable weapons. Panthers and Tigers outgunned and out-armored the M4 Sherman in direct engagements. On a technical level, the imbalance remained, but the war had shifted away from technical perfection. In the bocage country of Normandy, terrain neutralized many German advantages. Narrow hedgerows restricted maneuver. Long-range gunnery mattered less than coordination, visibility, and rapid support. American units adapted again, this time with speed born of experience. Tank infantry teams advanced together. Engineers blasted gaps in hedgerows. Artillery fired pre-planned concentrations. Air power loomed constantly overhead. German armor fought hard, but it fought alone. Fuel shortages constrained movement. Replacement crews were inexperienced. Maintenance became increasingly difficult under relentless Allied bombing. When panzers were lost, they were rarely replaced in equal number. American losses were heavy, but sustainable. Shermans burned. Crews were killed or wounded. Yet units remained operational. Tanks returned to service. New vehicles arrived daily. The battlefield became an equation of endurance rather than dominance. German commanders recognized the change. Reports from Normandy emphasized not American inferiority, but American persistence. Panzers could win local engagements yet lose the campaign. Each tactical success cost irreplaceable resources. Each American setback was absorbed and corrected. By August 1944, the German armor reserve in the West was breaking. At Falaise, Allied forces encircled and destroyed much of the German 7th Army. Hundreds of armored vehicles were abandoned or destroyed, not always by enemy fire, but by lack of fuel and spare parts. The myth of Panzer invincibility collapsed amid columns of wreckage. Axis armor still fought, but no longer dictated the war's tempo. That reality became undeniable one final time. In the winter forests of the Ardennes, the last gamble. December 1944, the Ardennes forest. Snow muffled the movement of men and machines. Low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. For a brief moment, conditions favored the attacker. German armor surged forward one last time. The Battle of the Bulge was conceived as a decisive stroke, a concentrated panzer offensive aimed at splitting Allied forces, seizing Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated peace. It relied on surprise, speed, and the belief that American units could still be thrown into chaos under pressure. Early gains seemed to support that hope. American positions were penetrated, supply routes disrupted. Isolated units fought desperate holding actions. Yet the pattern did not repeat Kasserine. American defenses bent, but did not break. Tank crews maneuvered under fire. Infantry held road junctions. Artillery fired continuously, often at point-blank range. Commanders retained control even as lines shifted. Units coordinated across sectors. German armor paid heavily for every mile. Fuel shortages became crippling. Vehicles stalled and were abandoned. Air power returned when skies cleared, striking columns and supply lines relentlessly. Experienced German crews were lost in numbers that could not be replaced. By January 1945, the offensive had failed. The last major panzer attack in the West ended not with breakthrough, but exhaustion. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine months later, German armor no longer represented a strategic threat. Individual tanks could still kill. Individual crews could still fight. But the system that once made panzer warfare decisive was gone. The Axis belief that Americans had no answer to German armor had been disproven not by a single battle, but by a sustained process of adaptation. And with that realization, the armored war entered its final chapter: learning, adaptation, and the evolution of armored warfare. The story of American forces facing German panzers is not one of instant triumph. It is a story of shock, loss, and relentless adaptation. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, the myth of panzer invincibility met its first serious challenge. Not with superior tanks, but with learning under fire. Courage alone was insufficient. Only rapid assimilation of mistakes could turn disaster into survival. By Normandy and the Ardennes, the lessons of Tunisia had matured into doctrine. American forces integrated tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power as a cohesive system. Industrial output ensured that losses could be replaced, crews retrained, and tactics refined continuously. The battlefield no longer favored technical perfection alone. It favored adaptability, coordination, and resilience. The Axis assumption that Americans had no answer to panzer armor reveals a broader truth about war. Superiority is never absolute. Experience, speed of learning, and the capacity to integrate human, technological, and organizational elements often outweigh raw firepower. The Germans had underestimated the human element: determination, discipline, and the ability to correct course under pressure. By the war's end, the panzers that had once seemed unstoppable became tools of attrition, not instruments of decisive victory. American forces had learned to survive, counter, and eventually dominate. The armored battlefield had evolved, not because one side built better machines, but because one side adapted faster. In the end, the legacy of this confrontation is clear. Wars are won not only by weapons, but by those who can turn failure into knowledge and knowledge into action. The Americans met the panzer myth, shattered it, and in doing so, reshaped the very rules of armored warfare.